Baker, the Learning Director at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. And with me today in front of the camera, I have my colleagues, Annalise Stratman and Diane Lalonde, and Sarah Mohammed is manning another, personing another station in case we have a technical glitch. We're so delighted today to bring to you from the Learning Network and the Knowledge Hub our webinar on understanding immigrant women's experiences and responses to intimate partner violence, looking beyond the cultural framing. And we're so pleased that Dr. Vathsala Illesinghe is presenting today, and she's joined by a couple of very special panelists, and later in her presentation, she will introduce you to them. We've had over 800 people register for this webinar today. And what we've found is while about half the people that register tend to join actively in the webinar, we also find that the same number tend to then access the recording of the webinar. So we're really pleased of the reach of these webinars, and especially when it is topics like today that are of such importance and timeliness in our country and in our neighboring country to the south. I'm going to go through some of the webinar instructions and then introduce Vathsala. And she's very kindly invited us to refer to her as Vathsala throughout this webinar. So we thank her for that. So our format today is similar to what it's been in the past. We're going to hear from Vathsala and later from her guests for about 1 hour. And then we will have an opportunity to present to Vathsala any questions that you put in the chat box. So please type them in throughout the webinar. We may not be able to get to all of them, but we'll do our best. And that will happen during the last 15 minutes of the webinar. You'll notice in the chat box during the last portion of today's webinar that there will be a link to the evaluation. And we can't stress enough how important that evaluation is. And it's for two reasons. One, we truly read them and we try to make changes. One of the changes we've made is that when a presenter is giving or gives us permission, that we're going to put in the chat box access to the presenter's slides. And then you can print them and make notes on them, look at them at your station during the webinar. And we are doing that because of the requests from people on the evaluations to do that very thing. And so that's one way. The other thing is that when you fill out the evaluation, that's what triggers your certificate of participation. So when you complete the evaluation, you will be given the option of clicking on the certificate of completion and doing a couple more things to fill out or complete, and then it will be emailed to you. So that we've had a very positive response to that. So we just want to remind you that that's how the certificate of attendance is generated. We also wanted to let you know that this webinar will be posted on both the Knowledge Hub site as well as the Learning Network site here at our center, so that you can access the recording or share it with your colleagues who weren't able to join us today. So at this point, I would like to introduce you to our primary presenter. Vathsala Illesinghe, Dr. Illesinghe, is a Policy and Studies PhD student at the Yates School of Graduate Studies at Ryerson University in Toronto. Before moving to Canada 5 years ago, Vathsala had worked as a doctor, a researcher, and a university professor in Sri Lanka. She has published some of the most widely cited work on intimate partner violence against women in Sri Lanka. She's led national action committees on women's health, contributed to national and multi-country studies, and has received several awards and grants for her work. After migrating to Canada and encountering barriers to finding work that is commensurate with her education and skills, Vathsala decided to go back to university to pursue doctoral studies. Her research is aimed at seeking a better understanding of the complex intersections of gender, violence, and immigration policy in Canada. In 2017, Vathsala became Ryerson University's first Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Scholar, a prestigious award indeed. She is a member of the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability's expert panel. And I think just listening to that brief description, there's no doubt of what has led Vathsala to the area of her research. And I know that we're going to be so enriched by her presentation today. Vathsala, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Linda, for those kind words and also the invitation to speak today. A warm welcome to everyone who also took the time to join this webinar. Now, if there are service providers among us, I know that there could be many. I'm sure you will agree with me that there are some things that you don't forget about the work that you do with women who've experienced abuse. One of the few things I clearly remember from the time that I worked as a young doctor, I should say about 18 years ago that was the first time that I encountered a woman who admitted to hospital because her husband had repeatedly kicked, punched, and smashed her head against a wall the previous night. Now, I remember her clearly because she also said, "I think he's going to kill me." It was a time that no one talked about violence against women, and healthcare providers did not have any resources, tools to help women when they presented to hospital. I remember sending her to the one shelter in the province at the time, and when I visited her the next day to check on how she's doing, they told me that she had returned to her husband. I remember feeling confused, helpless, and extremely frustrated for not being able to help this woman. Now, about a year later, I left hospital work to take up research and teaching at a university, and in the subsequent years worked towards getting a better understanding of violence against women and how we may respond to it not only within the hospital sector, but outside of it. Now, decades later, we know a lot more about violence against women, but still, unfortunately, in different parts of the world, even today, service providers face the same challenges and they feel the same frustrations of not being able to help such women. Even in places like Canada, although we may have better resources and services and supports to offer such women, we are still struggling to understand why women get killed by intimate partners, why they stay in abusive relationships, and why we haven't been able to prevent such violence. So the plan for today is to first talk a little bit about what is it that we know about immigrant women's experiences of intimate partner violence in Canada, and also the ways in which it may be shaped by immigration policies and the experiences of being an immigrant woman. We will also talk about the structural determinants of such violence and how they could become less visible when it is attributed to the cultural factors within certain ethno-racial groups in Canada. We will talk about structural barriers to help seeking and leaving abusive relationships, as well as lessons learned from providing services and supporting women from the front lines. Now, being a newcomer woman myself in Canada means that I have not spent enough time here working at the front lines, or to gain a deep understanding of what the service providers experience here. But fortunately, my co-speaker, who I will introduce in a little bit, has been working at Interval House, the longest standing women's shelter in North America, and she's highly qualified to speak in this regard. I also don't think it is interesting to listen to a monologue for 1 hour, however engaging or compelling that could be. And together we will discuss what we, as a community of scholars and practitioners, can do in sharing and advancing knowledge on this topic. Now, when we talk about violence against women, we know broadly that there are many ways of labeling and classifying this. This webinar is focused on intimate partner violence, what the World Health Organization defines as a range of abusive behaviors, either physical, sexual, psychological, experienced by women by married, cohabiting, or common law partners, including dating partners. Now, we also know that men can also experience abuse in intimate relationships and that it can happen in same-sex relationships. But across the world, the vast majority of intimate partner violence victims are women who have been abused by their male intimate partners. Now, this is relevant especially for immigrant and refugee women's experiences of intimate partner violence, because for the most part, the migration of people across borders and nations are conceptualized within heteronormative patriarchal models and controlled by policies that assume the traditional gendered roles for men and women. Men are considered the head of the household and the breadwinner, and therefore preferred as the more skilled, employable immigrant, while women are admitted into countries for their domestic and reproductive roles, that is, childbearing and caring roles. Although we are focusing on the Canadian immigration policies, what we know about immigrant women's experiences of intimate partner violence is informed by work in many other immigrant receiving and sending countries. Now, if we talk about the Canadian context, the year 2018 has been particularly grim with regards to violence against women statistics. According to the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability, which monitors the killing of women and girls in Canada, 106 of them were killed during the first 8 months of 2018. That is one woman or girl being killed every other day. 1/3 of these women were killed by a male intimate partner, and about half of them were killed in their home. Now, we also know that the number of women killed by an intimate partner is not a true reflection of the actual numbers of women who experience abuse. But on average, 1 in 3 women in Canada have experienced intimate partner violence in their lifetime, like in many other settings across the world. Now, what about the immigrant women's experiences of IPV? The true rate of IPV among immigrant women in Canada is really unknown. Whether it is using police statistics or surveys, the prevalence of IPV among immigrant women is severely underreported. Right? Although we know that IPV is underreported in general, even among Canadian-born women, this gap is likely to be greater among immigrants. If you are a sponsored wife and your status in Canada is dependent on your relationship to your abusive partner, or if you're a newcomer woman who does not know what your rights and entitlements are in a new country, these are added barriers to reporting abuse. We have also known for quite some time now that how we understand abuse could be different for different communities. We also know that there are language-specific ways of naming and labeling abuse. Surveys with women in multiple countries, including many of the Asian and South Asian countries, which are source countries for immigrants to Canada, we know that women only report IPV to people they trust, whom they can speak to in person, and when they feel safe and secure. If we apply this same understanding to the way we conduct surveys among immigrant women in Canada, we know that they will not report it over the phone in a language that they are not familiar with. They might be able to answer questions about where you live or where you work in English or French. But when it comes to speaking about your most personal experiences, the most painful ones, their language skills could be severely limited. Because of these limitations, some of the Canadian surveys, immigrant women's risk of IPV is underestimated when compared to Canadian-born women. Now, the problem is if we continue to collect data in these limited ways, we are not going to be able to accurately estimate immigrant women's vulnerability to intimate partner violence. And moreover, we are not going to be able to advocate for them or ensure that programs and funding is proportionately allocated to them. If immigrant women are hesitant to talk about abuse or respond to such questions in surveys and become underrepresented, it is not a cultural problem. It is a problem of survey methodology. With immigrants and immigrant women claiming a large and growing share of the population in Canada, almost 25% of the female population, a trend that is growing, understanding their risk and vulnerabilities, including that of violence, what constitutes abuse in different communities becomes an important consideration. We would have to find ways of bringing that understanding into our surveys rather than trying to fit them into a Eurocentric model. We know that service providers and community members, as well as researchers, are using such inclusive and culturally sensitive approaches in their work, but that responsibility should not be theirs alone. It should be everyone's responsibility to take that consideration in the way we gather and share data. Now, the next question is, how are immigrant women's experiences of IPV connected to their immigration experiences? Although we fail to estimate immigrant women's risk of intimate partner violence, there is strong evidence from cases and qualitative research that engaging in immigration process can impact a woman's risk of abuse in some direct and indirect ways. I mean, it's clear that women who have been sponsored and dependent on a male partner for permanent residency in Canada have reported being abused or being kept in abusive relationships using the threat of deportation if she reports it or leaves him. The implications of being refused permanent residency can be significant for women if there are children involved or if they are seeking refuge from violence or persecution in their home countries. But there are more overt ways in which immigrant women become vulnerable because immigration policies themselves are gendered in ways that are disadvantageous to women. As many of us know, there are three main pathways for permanent migration to Canada: the skilled, or what is now called the express entry, family class, and refugee or humanitarian grounds. But majority of immigrant women who arrive in Canada as permanent residents come as sponsored spouses or as dependents of their men admitted as skilled immigrants. Countries like Canada and Australia in particular use a points-based system, a skill-based listing of people based on the level of education, years of work, and language skills. Those with higher points, who are more likely to be men, are selected and allowed to work and live permanently in the country. Those who receive less points, a large share of whom are women, tend to be allowed entry as dependents of those men or through other restricted pathways. With the largest proportion of immigrants coming to Canada now being born in an Asian country, many of which are considered traditionally patriarchal societies, this is an important consideration. Women, particularly from the global south, are more likely to either get excluded from economic class or, because they have less access to the type of work or education that's been given value in a point system, become pushed into what are considered low-skilled feminized work, a trend that has been happening across the world in different settings. But this is evident when we look at population data. it is clear that immigrant women, the wage gap is greater when compared to both non-immigrant women as well as immigrant men. Recent immigrant women faced a 59% income gap compared to non-immigrant men. Such poverty and downward social migration that is associated with it have been linked to mental health issues, alcohol and substance abuse, and other health and social issues among both men and women. Alone and combination with other risk factors, they are known to increase women's risk of intimate partner violence. In fact, studies show that intimate partner violence experienced by some immigrant women from some traditionally patriarchal countries only happened when they arrived in Canada. Unfortunately, although we recognize that there are structural conditions which create women's vulnerability to violence, there has been a trend not only in immigration policies, but other social, welfare, and labor policies, which are weakening the benefits for immigrant women, promoting temporary forms of migration, creating gendered and racialized inequalities in the labor market. As we speak, the Ontario government is seeking to repeal parts of a bill which guaranteed equal pay for equal work, paid sick leave, and an increase in minimum wage. Measures which would have benefited the most precarious workers, many of whom are immigrant women, some of whom could be experiencing abuse or becoming vulnerable to it. But despite the evidence that abuse can begin post-migration and an understanding that these structural conditions can increase immigrant women's risk, there is a tendency to attribute such violence experienced by immigrant women to cultural factors than the structural ones. It is an American law professor who said, Letty Watt, who said, all cultures are patriarchal, not more or less, but maybe differently. But immigrant communities' issues, especially their experiences of abuse, tend to be attributed to patriarchy and their cultural factors. The women are made to bear the burden of their cultures, especially when it comes to things like how it's referred to as honor killings, assuming that if those communities became better integrated to the Canadian society, they would not experience IPV. It is also tied to the idea that some cultures are better or superior than others. Now, the risk of this framing of IPP is that it can make the structural conditions and determinants of such abuse invisible and take the attention away from the fact that the state has a responsibility in removing and addressing those inequalities. Overcoming these barriers then become a burden borne by those communities and service providers who help such communities. So I want to talk to Fazia about this as somebody who's had this experience from the front line, somebody who's worked with women who's experienced abuse. Fazia Mohammed, I'm going to, you can see. So Fazia Mohammed is the Community Programs Manager at Interval House. As you will soon hear, she is passionate about supporting and empowering women who are living abusive relationships and making them economically self-sufficient to break the cycle of violence. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so to help people better understand the context in which you work and the type of work that you do, could you please tell us a little bit about Interval House and what work you do there?
Okay, so Interval House is Canada's first shelter for women and children fleeing intimate partner violence. We opened our doors in 1973, and it came out of a need from the community. We started off as a drop-in center, and the women who opened the center found that some women didn't want to go home. And when they questioned them about that, they found out that they had been abused and that they were living in horrible situations, and realized there wasn't anything out there for these women, so they had to do it for themselves. And that's where Interval House started. The day we opened, the headline read something like, "Radical feminists house runaway wives." which is shocking to hear a prominent newspaper say something like that. But that was the environment that we opened up in. And we've been doing that ever since. We try to provide a safe haven. We are an emergency crisis shelter that's open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And we focus on providing a safe place for women and children fleeing intimate partner violence. And when they come, try to get them as quickly as possible into the community and hooked up to resources so that they could start their lives in terms of transforming it and breaking the cycle of violence. And part of that too is also working with them to find jobs and find housing and provide counseling.
So, working in Toronto means you are facing diverse communities, people from different cultures, and this whole question of how do we do cultural sensitive services becomes a question.
Right.
Tell us how would you work through that in the practical setting?
Well, Interval House is based in Toronto, and anyone who knows Toronto knows that it's pretty much the most multicultural city in the world. And as a result of that, the women that go through our doors run the complete swath of different ethnic groups. Everything goes there, and which actually, just as an aside, speaks to the fact that abuse knows no color barriers, no status barriers. The other thing we try to do is to, our hiring practices are actually reflective of the community that we serve. I think that's a really important point when working with diverse groups. As you mentioned when you were speaking, a lot of women who are coming from, who are immigrants may not feel comfortable articulating their experiences to someone, maybe someone of a different ethnic group, but also not in a language that they're familiar with. So that's something that when we're hiring counselors at the shelter, we ask questions as to, what other languages do you speak? And we also encourage hiring of people who can speak multiple languages to help work with the women that we see. That's definitely one of the things. And also to educate ourselves on everything. At the shelter, we celebrate every holiday and to try to educate ourselves as much as possible with respect to all of the different cultures that we serve.
That's exactly what I was talking about. It's about fitting our understanding of abuse. I remember very clearly once woman, I asked her about abuse. She said, "Oh, he doesn't hit me. He just smashes my head against the wall." Right? So if you use a questionnaire or a survey or even a screening instrument which asks, "Have you ever been hit?" she'd say no. Right?
That's because we talk about that too, right? So you have to be careful the language that you use, the words you use, it's open to interpretation. My understanding of abuse, and that's something we recognize too, is different than your understanding, maybe not so much, but everyone else's. And part of that is if you just fill out an assessment or you ask a simple question, you cannot assume that the person that you are asking is understanding it the same way that you mean it. And especially if you don't know their culture enough to probe further and of how they may articulate something, then you're going to miss the whole story and then also not be able to meet them and work with them.
I know, because I've spoken to you many times, and some of the most important work that is being done by Interval House and other agencies is about addressing the very same structural inequalities that make women vulnerable and keep them entrapped in it. And I do know you do a large amount of work, and we'd love to hear about it.
Absolutely. This is where the passion part's going to come in.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I mentioned, we opened Interval House in 1973. And for the most part, we were an emergency shelter. And back in the 90s, we thought, how can we do more? And we did a feasibility study. We spoke to past residents and asked them, what do they want? And as a whole, they're like, we want jobs. We need to be able to stand on our own. We need to be economically self-sufficient. Can you help us with that? And it was so overwhelming how much they needed that we realized that it was something that we had to address and deal with specifically. So we created the BESS program, BESS. It stands for Building Economic Self-Sufficiency. And what we do is directly in our name. And within the BESS program, it is an employment program. And the reason it is unique is that there are specific barriers to employment and employability that women survivors of intimate partner violence face, and that need to be addressed within that context, or else they will not succeed in their goals. And I think this is a really important point, because I've met tons of women that they themselves don't realize that the latent effects of having gone through intimate partner violence manifests itself when they are in the process of moving on and trying to achieve their goals, specifically looking for a job. There's something about trying to find a job that hits on all of those things: negative self-talk, the ability to reach for and try to achieve your goals. So that's something that we really recognize. And with respect to trying to combat these inequalities, we wanted to ensure that we share with the public what that means. So I'll just speak a little bit about this. So for those of you who are listening, I highly encourage you to go on intervalhouse.ca, and on there you'll be able to find a white paper that we wrote to share with everyone what we learned. It's called The Barriers to Employment and Employability for Women Survivors of Intimate Partner Violence. And there we highlight 5 principles that we think are really important when working with this population, or even thinking about when you're working with this population in terms of finding a job. And that's what we're talking about here. How do you address economic inequalities? We're talking about employment. And when we're talking about employment, just like Vathsala was saying earlier, there's precarious work employment, there is the lack of skills with respect to not having been educated in past patriarchal societies, as well as in Canada. But even on top of that, having gone through abuse comes with its own set of barriers. And so what are those? Very simply, one, there are so many barriers that the women are going to go through, whether it is housing, whether it is lack of knowledge of resources, whether it is lack of community, but the sheer number of them are huge. And first and foremost, that in and of itself becomes so overwhelming that it becomes an overarching barrier in itself. Also, that they affect each woman individually. So Vathsala and I, for example, could have the exact same experience and be affected in 2 different ways because of who we are as people. And the same thing with whatever the barriers are. So if we have multiple women who are, for example, did decide to leave an abusive relationship and are looking for a job, does maybe not have an education, they will achieve that in different ways. It will affect them in different ways. And why is that important? It is to recognize that that individual's experience and how it is experiencing it is relevant, and meet them where they are. Does that make sense? The other more difficult thing is that the barriers are interlinked. So the presence of one barrier will have negative impacts on other barriers. The good thing is the removal of a barrier will also have mitigating effects on the other barriers. And as Vathsala is talking about, we're talking about various intersecting identities, right? So that compounds the issue on top of that. So it's not enough that a woman has barriers with respect to having gone through intimate partner violence. They have barriers with respect to their immigration experiences, pre-migration, post-migration. Vathsala knows all about that. As well as being a woman of color, being different depending on their sexual orientation. All of those things compound each other. And they all lead to the ability to push past and be able to get a job, keep a job, and become economically self-sufficient. So when Vathsala is talking about there are policies in place that can often be hidden, this is part of it as well. Just even the knowledge of how abuse will manifest itself in work and whether or not it's even taken consideration. I highly value when government bodies or funders realize that it's not enough that you're just going to help this one group. You have to help them in each specific way because it affects them in each specific way. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. So, I mean, it seems there's so much to do, and not that we can do all of it at the same time. There's so many things to do. But one thing I would really like to ask you is that for most women experiencing intimate partner violence, leaving relationships and actually going to a shelter is never an easy experience, right? So you have this opportunity to meet a group of women who had that experience. And I know, as it was 18 years ago in Sri Lanka, even today, the time a woman goes to a shelter is not the first time or the last. She will go back, return to the abusive partner, and come back again. How do we use that opportunity to make sure that she comes back, stays with us, right? And prepares her to take the next step in leaving an abusive relationship?
Great question. Okay, so first of all, just to catch everyone up who doesn't have a background, experientially, we have seen that a woman will leave, and if she does have that courage to leave an abusive partner and go to a shelter or go to a friend, and we'll go back. Mm-hmm. And then we'll find it in her to do the same thing. On average, 5 times minimum before they go. Some even as much as 7 times before it's done. So as to what do we do to help them move forward? We talk a lot about motivation, right? When it comes to, first of all, when it comes to what a woman's about to do, after having gone through intimate partner violence, after having been told what to say, what to do, what to think, empowering a woman to make that decision for herself is going to be the key in helping her move forward and helping her leave and for good. Part of that is education, right? Educating her about the cycle of what is actually intimate partner violence, what is abuse, what is the cycle of violence, what is that power dynamic, and working with her to identify what she wants out of life and helping her know what is out there. What are her rights as a person living in Canada, for example, as we're speaking about Canada? What are her rights? What cannot happen to her? What is her situation? We talk so much about really understanding a woman full circle. It's not enough. A woman, every person is a full person. There's so much to do with who you are. So helping her on every single level in terms of what is out there for her. What is her access? What are the resources? What is this network? There is a hidden network out there. I tell women all the time, you don't know this, but there is, think of an invisible spider web. There is an invisible network of people, just the 800 people that are on right now and all over the world, waiting to help you not live this life. And so many women, when they are isolated from everyone else, and again, that's a huge tool that abusers use, is isolation, don't realize this. So part of really helping them know that this is possible is that knowledge that there are so many people out there, as well as who's done it before them. And if they can do it, you can do it too. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and there's a whole body of work around immigrant women's isolation as by itself being an added risk factor or a barrier. I mean, something I want to touch upon that you already said here was when you talk about this surmounting these barriers when it comes to immigrant women, something that we don't see, which is not very clear, is for her leaving an abusive relationship may not be just her own individual decision. It may not be even a decision of people who are around her in this country. It can extend as far as the family, the extended family they've left back home. So your decision to go to a shelter is not just your unique decision. It's about what your mother back home would think, what your mother-in-law who may not be here would think, So it comes with this whole family or extended network, as you said, of people who shape that decision and influence it in either positive or negative ways.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that if you make a shelter, if you make enough shelters, women will go, is by itself is not an intervention.
Absolutely.
And that is why we always talk about how you alone cannot do this work, and why a community of scholars and practitioners and advocates is part of this. So it's about helping women take these additional steps. And like you said, it's about working together.
Absolutely. Knowing what's out there. Vathsala and I met at a conference on this exact topic. And there are certain things, I've been working in this field for about 10 years. And there are things that she talked about in that workshop that floored me. I thought I knew. And then she talked about pre-migration stories and post-migration stories, and how a lot of the things that we do in shelters and the interventions we provide are really great things, but they're more useful if the individual comes from an individualist,
individualistic
identity community. Whereas if people who are coming from a collectivist identity community, not so much. Touching on what Vathsala was saying, that when we ask them, okay, there are these shelters, leave the abusive relationship, we're not just asking them to leave the abusive relationship, we're asking them to leave their identity, because part of their identity is the community, not just the marriage, but the entire community. And that's a really hard ask. The solution, I don't know. But all we can do is work together, try to find out what everyone else is doing and how best to support them. And what is important is to allow the woman to dictate what it is that she wants to do, and empower her and support her in her journey, whatever that turns out to be, because it is a big one, and it's a huge ask for someone to leave their most intimate relationship, even one as dangerous as intimate partner, as one that has intimate partner violence in it, and step out into the unknown. That's the thing with going to the shelter. It's unknown. You see the stuff in the movies, and it's scary, and is that what I'm going to be exposed to? And I won't know anyone, and they won't understand me, and it's lonely. But we talk about, for each woman, there is a tipping point. So when they are ready, what is important is that we educate ourselves so that we can meet them in such a way that helps them make that transition a little smoother.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and maybe also because you, like you said, you may have seen it in a movie, but you don't know any other woman who's ever gone to a shelter. And
you think you
don't know. Exactly, yes. So it's about success stories, right? I mean, one of the things we're struggling to show women from diverse ethno-racial backgrounds, immigrant women, is show me another woman who's done this successfully. Where are the success stories?
And the thing is that's the funny thing is that they're out there. We don't talk about abuse
enough.
People don't talk about in terms of what happens personally. There's so much, the women that we see, there's so much shame attached to having gone through abusive relationship that I don't understand, because I've been fortunate enough to not having gone through that. But I realize, that was part of what the abuse did, right? To make them feel ashamed. And we wouldn't be ashamed if you got robbed, or if someone stole your stuff. It's the exact same thing. You had no control over that. But yet it's there. So why is that? And that shame, part of that shame leads to us not talking about abuse in a very open way. We are worried about judgment, and definitely society has not been the best. I'm hoping with the prevalence of all of these conversations happening in social media, the Me Too movement, that it will get better. But those success stories are out there. There are people all the time that you think you don't know, but are in abusive relationships. And there are women out there who are successful. You think you don't know them, but they left abusive relationships. And I've been fortunate enough to go to different events and go to different speakers and meet very powerful business women who've been kind enough to share their experiences with our clients, that they themselves have gone through abusive relationships. And I won't name them, but they're out there. And what is important is to recognize that we need to let those stories be known. We need to make it okay, make it safe for people to tell their stories, no matter what it is, without judgment, because there is always someone listening on the side. I'm in that right now, and I haven't told anyone. Why wouldn't they tell you? Because they don't know that it's safe to do that, right? So, and part of that is having those open conversations. When was the last time, anyone listening, when was the last time you had a conversation with your friends or your family about violence? Usually we wait until we're in it, or someone we know, or we talk about that person. Not generally speaking, this is how I feel about it. And because the person listening on the side who is experiencing it is living in fear that anyone finds out, as well as what their abusive partner would do, isn't telling anyone. If they did hear you talk about how your feelings, and if it was more open, then they're more likely to find out, okay, maybe there's a possibility here.
And it's also recognized that you are not more or less, depending on your ethno-racial background, whether you experience violence or find ways of leaving it. Mm-hmm. It's beyond that. So, as you said, I mean, during one of our most interesting conversations about interventions and solutions, I remember clearly you said, maybe we should stop looking for a one-size-fits-all, a model, because you researchers, you are always asking us to talk about how can we do this, right? And that has stayed with me. That has stayed with me all this time when I'm trying to, gather evidence, put them together, summarize, and write it up.
Yeah. I remember that conversation. We had a great lunch, and Vathsala had asked about maybe there's a way that we can come up with some type of formula that would assess when a woman's ready, right? When a woman is ready to leave, and also what is going to be the thing to help.
The determinants of helping.
Yeah. Here's the thing. There isn't one. Mainly because it's humans, right? Whenever we deal with humans, there is no specific one-size-fits-all thing. My coworker said it best the other day. She says, we're in a very interesting environment, interesting type of work, in that we kind of have to have a special individual formula for each person, because you have to meet that person where they are. It kind of touches on what I said earlier, in that each barrier affects, the barriers are unique to that person, and it also affects them in their unique way. So it's important to not think that every person is going to experience intimate partner violence in the exact same way. Is not going to, when will they leave will depend on that particular person, right? We've had women who, one side of abuse, whether it's physical or emotional, would leave. On the other side, I think it was a year or two ago, we had a woman, 72 years old, after 50 years of marriage, finally found the courage to leave. And that was huge for her. And that was huge for us, looking at that and realizing that there's always hope. So because of that, it is important to recognize that we are never going to find what we always want in society, that special magic formula to help a person, that special formula that's going to dictate how a woman leaves. But to encourage women, to work with them wherever they are and help them move forward. And some of the things, you want to talk about some of the things, and ultimately, their motivation, their internal threshold is going to dictate what that is. And it's going to, they're going to, like we said before, they're going to go back and forth. That's okay. That is their journey. You is important to an individual. And I'm going to speak to this because I've had so many people, because they know what I do, talk to me. They'll call me randomly and say, listen, I have a friend who just told me that they're in an abusive relationship. What do I do? And I would tell them what to do, encourage you to call the Assaulted Women's Helpline. If you're in Ontario, find out. A lot of shelters, they're open 24 hours a day. They have crisis lines. Give them that number to call. But how do you, as a friend, and I encourage you to go on integralhouse.ca to also learn about it. But what is really important is to recognize that that woman's experience is her own. And it's not going to follow any one specific route. And just because she says that she wants to do this one thing doesn't mean she's not going to take it back. And what is important is to support her throughout that whole thing. Do not isolate her any further by then, well, you said you were going to leave and I'm so tired of working with you and you keep saying that and then you don't, are you kidding? That's as hard as it is to hear, it's even harder to go through. So it's important to have patience and give that woman space to go through it, whatever that looks like, and just support her throughout that.
Would you also say that involves being aware of and recognizes our own inherent biases?
Absolutely.
Towards whether it's a person's skin color, race, where they come from, value based on social status, all of those things. Sometimes they're so hidden and embedded. I've often heard people say, it's women who are more, discriminatory towards women. It's without recognizing that it is a result of living in a community that has told them that's what it is. They're so embedded in it that they don't recognize it themselves. So people ask, what can we do as frontline service providers in helping and supporting women? And I think everywhere, not just in service provision, but in a community, it's all about recognizing those biases. And living in a diverse society means that there are so many levels of it and layers of it.
It is a constant work on yourself to learn as everyone has biases. Everyone has stereotypes. What is important is to learn what they are. Realize that people have different experiences, and you can live in the exact same space and have completely different experiences because one, because of your skin color, two, because of language, accent, whether or not you were born here, whether or not you just came. And your experiences are going to be shaped by that. And how people experience you is also going to be shaped by that. And that's I think what Vathsala is talking about in recognizing that, how are you interpreting this person? Are you interpreting it within a context of what you see and what your stereotypes are for that particular person? And that, again, always comes back to awareness and education, right? And breaking that down and talking to people and challenging yourself to look beyond what is there in front of you, and that it is possible that you too could be biased.
Mm-hmm. We've known for quite a long time that women's experience of violence is an intersection of so many social inequalities. It's not just gender, it's race, economic class, ethnicity, and now immigration status. But something we've not quite looked at or recognized is that how people's lives are now a lot more transnational, being connected in multiple ways from where they come from and where they're living now. So that understanding, I think that's was one of the perspectives that has been helpful for us to talk about, is the understanding I bring from working with immigrant women from where they live and where they experience and respond to violence can in some ways inform the way we respond to them in Canada. I think we don't have much time left, but to sort of sum up, is there something that you would like to add?
I think I pretty much said what I think is important in terms of knowing someone. Be open, right, to talking about it. Have conversations and connect with the community. The way Vathsala and I connected was very powerful in that we force ourselves to go through the process of learning each other's perspectives, because she's coming from both the intimate partner violence and immigration, and I'm coming from intimate partner violence and a focus on employment. And by coming together, we're able to have a better understanding of the entire experience of women going through intimate partner violence. And by a better understanding, we're able to then help more women. That's ultimately what it's about, is to help women and children, transform their lives, and break the cycle of violence. And that can only, not everyone can do everything, and that can only happen if we work together, get to know what everyone is doing, and try to understand all of the needs and meet them as best as we can. That's a conversation.
Okay, so as always, it has been a good chat, I should say. I mean, this short discussion, we must accept, cannot do justice to the growing body of work or the large amount of work that is being done on violence against women and immigrant women's experiences of violence and ways of providing services, both in Canada and beyond. It is just an attempt to sort of highlight some of the key lessons, gaps, and recognize the valuable work being done by researchers, advocates, and service providers. Now, the sources of information I think that we have used, some of it is from others, the work that others have done, but most of them can be found, I know, on the Learning Network's website and also on your own website. If you want additional information about anything that is not there or on a specific aspect, you could reach out to us or through the Learning Network. We have, together come a long way, and I believe recognize that violence against women is a complex problem. And when we have diverse communities living together with inequitable access to resources and support, it becomes an even more challenging one. But a strong community of scholars, service providers, and advocates can help share knowledge, collaborate, and advocate for the most vulnerable groups. I think that's important, even though there may be structural barriers and determinants of violence, we can push for addressing some of those. And I think together we make a small contribution towards that goal today. I'm grateful to Fazia, the Learning Network, and everybody who joined together for being part of this effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vathsala and Fazia. And I'm not even going to take any more time. We'll express our appreciation at the end of the discussion because so many comments came in and questions in reaction to your presentation. So I want to just move right on to those. One of the things, just as a general comment, there was real appreciation expressed for your recognition of the structural barriers that women experience and distinguishing those. They may be embedded within patriarchy and they may be different or expressed differently in certain cultures, but that distinction was really appreciated, and I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you.
One of the questions that came in, and they're sort of related, so I'm going to group those together, and I'll start with one. You talked about that we need not to have a one-size-fits-all. And so the question is, what kind of training do we need to do to support frontline workers so that they're ready and have the training they need to not do a one-size-fits-all? What would that training look like? Is it a different set of skills? And what skills would those be?
I mean, this is a very important question. I'm glad that somebody asked it. And I've always asked this, even from Fazia before. If we agree that if it is not a one-size-fits solution, how does service providers who have to deal with a large number of women work within constraints of time and resources, how do we do it, right? I don't think we have an answer. If we did, we probably won't be having this conversation today. But it comes from multiple places and multiple ways of recognizing that, one, we all need an understanding of violence that is not set in any one Eurocentric, understanding of it. You need to know that there are different ways. So the part of the training is about recognizing what is violence, awareness, the determinants of it, that there are structural and cultural ways of talking about it, and then creating barriers to women seeking services. It's about awareness. So one piece is about that awareness. And I don't think there is like an end to it. There is like, you don't say, okay, we've done it. We've had our training for 2 weeks on what is gender-based violence or what's violence against women. We are now a competent. It does not happen. I mean, I can tell you the number of workshops where I've run, trained the healthcare providers for 5 days. And at the end of the day, at the last day, it would be usually a man who would get up and say, but what do we do about violence against men? And I feel like I have spoken for 5 days about this. You know, it never ends. It never ends. So because we are constantly challenged to look at our understanding and the multiple layers of sort of embedded ways in which we don't recognize our sort of biases, right? So one of the things I would say is the training or awareness building never stops. It continues.
I definitely have a response to this. So here's the thing. You know, all of the service providers hire highly educated people, right? From a different disciplines, social workers, counselors, I don't know what they're called, the violence against women coordinator, I don't know what they're called. But it's not the training, actually, that will be the key to ensuring that it's not a one-size-fits-all model. It is the actual structure of the programs of the service providers. If you, as a program, your model is designed to not to be that flexible, right? To have that not have that one-size-fits-all, to actually meet the woman where they are, that'll actually be the determinant for whether or not you're effective in meeting that person. You can have, there is no, you know, one-size-fits-all training course, right? Anyone, anyone with training in terms of counseling and whatever is relevant for that particular service provider, it's not the individual that's going to be the key. It's going to be the actual agency in the program, and whether or not you value having an adaptable program, and that you embed that within your logic model to design a program that actually meets those needs and is flexible enough to ensure that the individual coming in is seen as an individual, and not say, okay, let's apply this formula to them and hopefully that works out. And it won't work out because humans aren't built that way. Does that answer your question?
I can't talk to the person who asked the question, but I think your comments have probably been very helpful to everybody listening. Along the same lines, one of the questions came in was, first it started with a comment that was, they believe that many programs are based on an individualistic model or framework. And you spoke of the importance of understanding collectivist societies, experiences. And how do you move a program if currently they're more based on individualistic frameworks? How do you move towards, and what would that program look like if it was really responding to a collectivist reality?
Have you thought about this? I'm going to ask Fazia.
No, I think this is something that you will be able to. So this is actually the crux of what I learned from Vathsala when I attended her workshop. She was the one who highlighted this need for me. So this is a question that I have myself, right? Because I hadn't even thought about it. After the workshop, after the conference I went to where I met Vathsala in the workshop, I sat for 3 months and talked to everyone I knew about this whole idea and looked at what we were doing. So I don't actually have a response for this, because this is something that I feel as a society, we haven't even begun to incorporate, right? Just even dealing with intimate partner violence in as how we understand it is something that we're still working on and we're still being flexible about. I don't think as a society we've even identified that so much of the population that we serve comes from not just a different culture, but a different identity, right? So even the awareness of it isn't there, much less than redesigning that. So in response to redesign, I couldn't tell you, you know.
If we look at societies where it is collectivistic, and how do women respond to abuse in those communities, there might be a clue. Right? the way women would come to contact with service providers or even begin to seek services is by first talking to their family, their neighbors, their extended family. So it's through these very informal networks. Now, there might be a place for building that network, although it may be not your family or your neighbor, but those women who have gone through this experience could be your key sort of informant, the person who starts it, starts building that network. It could be very slow, progressive work. I mean, it takes years, but you begin to build that community of people that will then reach out to those women. Am I making sense?
That's actually what I've been doing. So after I met with Vathsala and I was thinking about this whole collective, how do you help women who come from a collectivist identity background? And that's what we do in the MESS program, is that we a lot of what our workshops now are social things to encourage the women to meet other women and to start to develop their own networks. Because if that woman is now leaving her abusive partner, she's also often leaving her community. You need to create a new one. So, having the space, and we do that in interval houses, have the space to actually encourage people to socialize. We have a spring high tea, and we have, let's go to the movies together, and we just started a book club. And yet, this is an employment program, because what we realize is that for employment, you're going to need to address a lot of other things if you want the employment part to be successful. And part of that is encouraging to, I don't want to use the word network, because that term elicits the networking kind of idea. Yeah. This is more creating a new community, right? A community of support. And with that will then help with the having to somewhere to identify. And we've noticed time and again, the women that they may have left the abusive relationships, they may have gotten a place to live, they have gotten a job, but are they able to move forward? And those that are still isolated, those that do not have friends, have a harder time. They are still by on paper they look successful, but they're having a harder time because they do not have that sense of community. So I feel like as service providers, you may not necessarily have the answer to change from an individualistic identity program model to a collectivist identity program model. But what you can do is create space and create opportunities to encourage people to have that support system. And it could start with the workers, but also encourage them to have a support system in and of themselves. And just as adults, they're independent of abuse. Can't make friends after you leave high school and university, and you can't make a friend after that. It's difficult. So encouraging opportunities to do that, it's not a waste of time and resources. It's important because this is part of what will encourage them to be able to move forward.
Right. Thank you very much. I wanted just to let you know, first of all, that when you said, does that answer the question earlier, there was a comment by the person who actually asked that question that it did answer her.
Okay, I'm so glad. I
wanted to share that with you. I wanted to just share another comment that was very insightful and just hear your response to it. One of our participants just urged a little caution about the word, the use of the term when women have enough courage to leave, and just pointed out that you're talking so eloquently about all the structural barriers, and really it makes it sound like those barriers, it's about courage rather than the barriers that may be preventing that, and that women who haven't left, that then if you carry that a step further, it can be said, which we would worry about, that it's their lack of courage that they haven't left. And did you want to just comment on that? Yeah.
Shall I do it? So I will comment on this.
I think it's the way you
Yeah.
perceive. Yeah.
Yeah. It is definitely the perception or the way you can interpret what I said. So let me clarify. Courage is so present in any woman, first of all, in any person, and in any woman who is in intimate partner violence. There is no lack of courage there, whether you are in it or you choose to leave. I think it's more the motivation, the tipping point. I'm having trouble finding the word, but it is the act of leaving that is what we were talking about. So
it may not be even the individual, it's that all the structural conditions that prevented her or entrapped her in an abusive relationship may have now created the conducive condition. She may have got a permanent residency. She may have, through one of your programs, had access to a program. So she's in a place where she feels empowered, or she feels...
Empowered is the word.
Better word, I guess.
Yeah.
She feels she's able to make that decision. And I agree with the countless women that I've encountered. It's different for different women, and we recognize that women are resilient. The fact that they remain in an abusive relationship with a man who smashed their head for 3 years every day speaks to a different form of resilience. So I think it's talking about how all those factors come together for a woman in a particular point of time that enable her to take that very important step.
Yeah, and speaking as to the step, we talk about that for each person, when that step is, I like to use the term, there's a tipping point for each person. So that's the term I usually use, is that there's a tipping point, and it's individual as to when they will be able to leave. And it's not something that she knows. It's not something that we can guess at. It'll just be that moment and that opportunity and that knowledge of what's out there, and then they may leave. And of course, as we talked about earlier, that they may go back and forth for a few times.
I'm afraid we're out of time. There's a number of questions, good questions that we didn't get to, but we'll look for other formats to be able to share some of those. So at this point, on behalf of the Knowledge Hub and the Learning Network teams and all of our participants, I want to thank you, Vathsala, and thank you, Fazia, for leading us in this discussion and sharing your knowledge and experience.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, and so to all the participants still on, please complete the evaluation, and we'll read them, look forward to them. So that's all for now. Bye.